Okay, hello everyone. It is great to join you and thank you, of course, for having me. Welcome to my talk, The Echoes of History in Contemporary Australian Gothic Film. This is about the setting and what it is about the place that these stories take place that is both Gothic and uniquely Australian. If it's going to let me change, there we go. The following presentation does include themes and discussion of events that can be distressing. So just a bit of a warning there, and also, of course, contains spoilers for some films, especially The Babadook and the Nightingale. And Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are advised that this presentation includes images of people who have died. So good morning from where I am, or evening, or wherever you are in the world. I am coming to you from Wadawurrung country in Australia, and I wish to start in what is customary here by acknowledging this traditional land on which I present to you today. I also wish to acknowledge First Australians as the nation's first storytellers, and it's stories, of course, that bring me to you today. My name's Erin King. I'm a language and arts educator and researcher. I teach high school English, history, and media studies, and I believe in a really strong interdisciplinary approach to teaching in general, but especially across my subjects, which is what brings all of this together today. Currently, I am undertaking a research project where I was seeking to understand the historical, the cultural influences on Australia's national identity, and particularly individual Australians' identity, and how this is represented in popular culture. This quickly led me to the Australian film industry and the development and production of our Gothic films. So while this is a discussion on national identity and national history, it's also been a personal exploration of how contemporary Australian Gothic films have shaped me as a film, literature, and history teacher, but importantly, has shaped me as a non-Indigenous Australian woman. Australia is known as a land of vast, haunting landscapes. Scattered around our coastline are our large, diverse cities and regional and rural settings, and places that are physically isolated from the mainland. What they have in common are complex histories. The country is a place where beauty and terror, celebration and protest, pride and shame often exist side by side. Today, I'll be exploring how these elements converge in contemporary Australian Gothic films, particularly how this is represented in the setting. The term I like to use for this is place, however. The reason I prefer to use this term where I can is that it encompasses the many different ideas of what place is. It's the physical, the emotional feeling of place, the historical views, and it of course acknowledges that First Australians' relationship with the land can be in contrast to colonial views of the land. So the Australian Gothic is, of course, more than just a genre, and the term I like for this one is framework, being a reflection of anxieties, histories, and questions about identity. Traditionally, Australian Gothic portrays the land as both sublime and menacing, and one that grapples with ghosts of our colonial past. Recently, it continues to do so, intertwined with the vampiric effects of late-stage capitalism. The Australian film industry, as we know it, is young, so take a moment perhaps to consider what you immediately think of when you think Australian film. Assumptions that I might make there would be you might think of the land, you might think of the monsters, maybe the distinct characters that represent Australian identity. I know for me, particularly comedy figures come to mind, Indigenous stories, as well as our horror films. So while I acknowledge the distinction between the Gothic and horror, horror is, of course, often intertwined with Australian cinema. These films developed after the Australian film industry initially faced challenges in establishing, and this was in part due to competition with Hollywood and also the views that Australians had on our own productions. The horror genre began to see global recognition, and it developed driven by creative and cultural ambition with the need for commercial success. I'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. When it comes to horror, many of the horrors here are usually known as opposed to revealed. And the horror is often in the inability to stop it or the inability to control it or to not be able to seek safety anywhere. An example being Waking Fright, which is recognised as one of the very first Australian Gothic films. Our films, art, music, and literature often share similarities in themes and have been influential on the development of the Australian Gothic film. And it brought me to reflect on a bit of a question that I've noticed the more I watch these films across, several decades, but also more recently, is why and how does Australia's history continue to haunt its art and film? I'll touch a little bit about history first so that we can see how this is represented in the place that these films are set in. I look at it through a double lens. Firstly, considering what is the history that has been lived, and that can, of course, be hegemonic or remembered subjectively. And second, the way history is being portrayed, including how it's been intertwined with the Australian Gothic film in its origins. The Gothic land in Australia is one of dispossession and violence. Before Terra Nullius, this land was Terra Australis, or the Southern Land. This speculation of a southern space to balance the Northern Hemisphere long mythologised what did become Australia. The name, of course, derived from this concept. While James Cook's voyages mapped Australia as distinct to Antarctica, this interplay of myth and discovery shaped historical narratives, even as these myths were debunked. However, there is another Latin term, terra nullius, that was declared as a legal principle decades after British settlement. The term holds both the beliefs of the land prior to 1788 and has been the foundation of settlement. The term ignores the home of first Australians and views their relationship with the land as one of purely being owned. Well, this doesn't dismiss that they have an understanding of land ownership. It does dismiss their relationship as custodians. A land in which customs and laws were a right of its people for tens of thousands of years and has been deeply misunderstood. The effects of this is still being felt as a society, though and seen through our understanding of history through art and literature. It's not the only tension that the land has bore witness to. For example, the gold rush of the 19th century established a xenophobic response to non-white immigration, particularly Chinese immigration. Violent resistance against perceived injustices and oppression by authorities from the poorer working class through events such as the Eureka Stockade or the story of Ned Kelly and his family. The delay of Australia in marriage equality and the too long process of dismantling discriminatory laws which marginalised LGBT post-war boom and growth of its mining and industrial sectors. All of this has contributed to the country's sense of self, and there are many different threads of stories and the way history was experienced in all of these. Therefore, alike the castle ruins, the ancient manors, decaying monasteries, and overgrown cemeteries, the myth of Terra Australis set it in narratives as sublime, uncontrollable, and isolated. This sublime beauty set alternative narratives for settlers, for first Australians, and for convicts. The wide variety of experiences underpins this complex Australian identity and the complex narratives, though there are, of course, dominant ones that emerge which have set the conventions of Australian Gothic film. Despite a land that was stolen and declared the Crown's, settlers found the land unforgiving and challenging. The harsh and unfamiliar climate, the isolation both geographical and cultural, being worlds away from what they knew, and the economic, social, and psychological strain eventually saw them adapt. This has shaped Australian self-image and a narrative as one of hard work or an Aussie battler, finding wealth in the land through mining, agriculture, and a mateship that's established as they face this together. Convicts' experiences were, of course, different, although their own resilience has led to similar mythologising of Australia as a lucky country. Their long, difficult journeys, hard labour, cruel punishments, and their social stigma set the stage for resistance movements and rebellions. Tickets of leave and eventual transition to free settlers saw many of them establish livelihoods that transferred to their descendants. Along with this grew the idea of the Australian dream. It is important to remember that this experience largely did not extend to women, and the female factories and women's experiences are an often overlooked part of the convict system. Of course, for Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations, massacre, violence, and dispossession came to them in brutal ways. The complex conflict between celebrating the success of settlement and acknowledging the impacts of colonisation, particularly the ongoing impacts, or the remembering of the date where these occurred, divides Australians to this day. A core to the Australian Gothic is how Aboriginal Australia is represented, how it's ignored, how it's being violated, and of course, as well, adding to that complexity, is how it is celebrated. The foundation of all of this history is the land in which it has happened and that the stories are then told. It is an ancient land, and despite a belief that Australia lacked the antiquity to import the growing popularity of the Gothic genre in its own realisation, the land itself is ancient. And many parallels with the physical, geographical features of Australia have been drawn with the conventions of the Gothic, such as a description of caves in New South Wales being vaulted and groined like a cathedral. While conditions were harsh for some, it's also what the people on the land did and how the land is tied to that horror of history that invokes the terror and manifests in film. And these are the cathedral caves in Apsley, so you can see that parallel drawn with the Gothic in the geographical features. In 1895, Mark Twain toured Australia on a lecture tour. And in this quote, I think it very much holds what my relationship is with Australian history and has been over the years, is that Australian history does not read like history, but like the most beautiful lies. In the wider quote here, he also mentions the contradictions in Australian history, which are all true, and that complexity is, of course, woven in these representations. It's the Gothic that has confronted this idea of history as a lie, both directly and indirectly. The late 18th century is, of course, a pivotal time in the foundation of the Gothic. But what I love about the Gothic is its constant evolution and the different ideations of it. Particularly, my interest, of course, is the Australian Gothic, as I found it to be a guide for me to explore my own identity as an Australian, particularly my relationship with our history and as an educator. This time, of course, coincides with the arrival of the First Fleet into Sydney Cove. Art of this time can serve as a historical record that reveals the beliefs, values, and the emotions connected with Australia. What has happened over time is this depiction changes, and that's been alongside the complex change in society, become reflective of the harsh realities of colonisation and the sentiments held in the time of the production. Throughout its history since the 1780s, the perception of Australia has shifted from a torturous prison colony that was hell for convicts to perceptions as being a lucky country, to one that is divisive and presents challenges for younger generations, and one where marginalised Australians work to claim back narratives and autonomy. Another visual art medium can highlight how this land has been represented as a force and has established this convention of place to how it appears in the Gothic. It is seen as a force that is as sublime, as seen in these images. One of isolation and that is consuming, as you see these figures begin to be wrapped by that land. And one of decay and isolation in which figures who inhabit it must persevere to survive, despite how harsh rural life in Australia can be. And then we have these early established Australian Gothic films where all of this becomes a haunting force following them. Australian cinema faced many challenges, and much like the Aussie battler mythology, there was a struggle to develop. While there were some early Australian films, including one of the first narrative feature-length films in the world, the industry struggled to compete with Hollywood, which has been attributed to financial struggles and government attitudes, which then permeated social attitudes. This saw Australian film as a cultural backwater and something that the industry has had to shake for a long time. The tension between artistic expression and commercial industry significantly shapes Australian film. This has been influenced by policies and audience preferences. Prior to the 1970s, Australian films suffered due to a preference for television and their disdain of what they saw on screen as the ochre genre. Hollywood's dominance at the box office and the international but not local success of many Australian films underscores a concern with seeing our national identity represented in our national cinema. For example, films such as The Babadook, which I'll talk about a bit more later, and Peter Weir's films, The Cars That Ate Paris and Picnic at Hanging Rock, were more commercially successful overseas than they were in Australia. Yet, they are very important films to Australia. The complexity and influences on why this has happened is not the primary focus here, but it does point to a need to assert national identity through screen, linked to that repression of a representation or a need to tell the truth. The identity is complex, complicated, and varied. Sometimes this identity is tied to history. Sometimes it's an identity that's been thrust upon us. And sometimes it's one which we are trying to claim as our own. This may contribute to the central motif of place, of the land, of our Gothic films. One thing we all have in common is this place in which our stories happen. Be that the city, suburbia, the coast, the islands, the outback, rainforests, rural settings, the snowfields, the mountains, rivers, many more. You can see the varied range of places that there are reflects the various ways we are represented in our different relationships with it. And of course, there are also ghosts for many that are still here. Australia's contribution to Gothic cinema is mostly absent prior to the 1970s. During this decade, films such as Ted Kotcheff's Waking Fright and Peter Weir's Picnic at Hanging Rock established the convention of setting as one that is hostile and dangerous. It is an antagonist that is vengeful, and this perhaps reflects anxieties of one day needing to pay back for having stolen it. Additionally, The Cars That Ate Paris, also by Peter Weir, and George Miller's Mad Max films depict the road in Australia not as a place of freedom or escape or adventure, but of a place of peril. And Wolf Creek has extended this further as a conduit that will actively carry us deeper into this. More recent Gothic titles, such as Wolf Creek 2, which came out the same year as The Babadook, despite facing criticisms of being gratuitous in its violence, was a commercial success. The Babadook and the Nightingale by Jennifer Kent exemplify this genre's evolution, and it's Kent's work that I will focus on today. The setting of both of her feature films are very different, though they are both emblematic of aspects of Australia as a nation, much like previous films of the genre. The suffocation of the domestic space and the fear of the negative space in The Babadook, and The Nightingale symbolises the setting as a force that haunt women and Aboriginal people in the film. Cultural consciousness and feminist values of the 21st century Australia appear to have been carried through a revival of Australian Gothic. There have been recent television remakes of these classics, such as Picnic at Hanging Rock in 2018 and a TV series of Waking Fright in 2017. These Kent's films contain a recognition of both the impact of patriarchy and colonialism. And this makes this revival of Australian Gothic speak to a current generation. This parallel development of Australian Gothic alongside Australia as a nation argues for its enduring relevance as a genre capable of standing the test of time. While I do focus on race and gender, in a sense, in this talk, of course, there are further complexities to be explored, such as society's queer and xenophobic history, the impacts of the climate crisis and capitalism, and they all have emerged through the Australian Gothic as well. And I would love to explore that further at some stage. Historical political changes have impacted Australia's multicultural image and consequently have impacted its racism and xenophobia. Massacres, the Stolen Generation, the referendum of 1967, the White Australia policy, native title, and the Mabo decision to overturn terra nullius all had very real impacts across the nation. For example, the othering of Aboriginal Australians in early films, though not always recognised as Gothic films, certainly a precursor. In my own recognition and definition of Australian Gothic, I do see them as that, such as Jeddah, which is a 1955 film, and Walkabout, which represents, both of these represent perhaps attitudes of an Australia that's attempting to leave behind its First Peoples. They also serve to us reminders of a difference in ability of Aboriginal Australians and settlers to understand the environment or be able to survive on its land. It's something that non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal filmmakers have repeatedly explored. That's the trauma and the treatment of Aboriginal people. Additionally, Ausploitation film Dead End Driving speaks to an acknowledged attitude of prejudice towards Asians, particularly when Carmen and aggressive inmates of the drive-in fear their arrival and respond by chanting Asians out. While depictions of racism by white Australians may be perceived by modern viewers as unacceptable, or that Australia has now moved past this, the fact that these themes endure throughout the decades and in contemporary Australian film speaks to an implied acknowledgement that the country does battle with this with its identity when it comes to race. Patriarchal representations and the enduring impact of colonisation have long been reflected in Australian Gothic film on women as well as Aboriginal Australians. In Picnic at Hanging Rock, young women are depicted as virginal, pure and proper, in white, modest formal dresses, yet there is a character that does still objectify them. The challenges confronting Australian women today derive from historical legacies of colonialism and patriarchal structure in Australian society. There are many issues that challenge women throughout Australia, and this evidence from the 2024 Status of Women report card issued by the Australian government, and the way the status of women is disseminated throughout society, highlights that there are several prominent issues and can help us understand who Australian women are. The inequality of women's experience is historic, but today is evident in the imbalance of unpaid care, pay disparity and security, leadership opportunities, as well as gender-based violence. These challenges are, of course, exacerbated for people living with disability, migrants, queer, trans, or Indigenous women. Women in Australia are also diverse, educated, and hardworking, despite the challenges they face and the historical traumas that they live with. The narrative of Australian Gothic texts reflect historic and modern experiences of women in Australia. Recent history, including the post-COVID-19 pandemic period, can point to a particular change of national identity in the beliefs, attitudes, and the role of domestic spaces in the lives of Australians. The change in how the home is now viewed, including a stolen land, in difficulty attaining the Australian dream, and a shift in the role of women in Australia. The Great Australian Dream of home ownership has seen a monumental and cross-generational split that underlies this aspect of national identity and supports a changing nature of identity. The position of history in understanding the present, the importance of considering contemporary examples by comparison with the past, this can offer us further insight into the way place is treated in Australian Gothic film. These challenges are paradoxical with where and how Australians live and contribute to a feeling of being both in place and being out of place simultaneously. The continuous thread of race and gender through the Australian Gothic's history is through place, either on the land or in the home, and the societal influences of the production era impact this way it's represented. The diverse land has dark secrets. This becomes the essential convention of Australian Gothic. Therefore, considering all this history and the themes in the central convention of place is essential. While outback and bush settings have defined earlier films of the genre, contemporary Australian Gothic films reflect a 21st century society. The modern workplace, education settings, urban, suburban, or a regional setting could all subvert the Australian land trope, as long as its representation considers present societal influences and that the film's characters are consumed by this environment. As with the impact of Australian art through the 19th and 20th centuries, just some parts that I showed earlier, on Australian stories and cinema and identity, Contemporary Australian art could also be looked to for influence and a reimagining in various film conventions, such as through costuming, lighting, or framing. Ghosts and the haunting atmosphere of any Gothic art form may be represented in a contemporary way as through these references to past injustices that are still haunting the nation, as we resolve to reconcile with a national identity. The Australian Gothics conventions can serve as cultural analogues. They express ways that are unique to the nation, but still retain roots in their European origins. Contemporarily and in the past, the Australian Gothic in all forms manifests as a national trauma, particularly in regard to race and gender, which is why I'll be looking more closely at two films by the incredible Jennifer Kent. Firstly, I'll look through the home and gender in The Babadook. The increase that we've seen in Australian women writing, directing, and producing, and the home as a place of violence towards and by women, has looked to a Gothic framework to bring this narrative to light. This idea of home as a place of violence towards and by women speaks to the complexity in the narrative of female violence in Australia. This is one that the country is currently grappling with, particularly in regard to the safety of women at the hands of their partners and men they know, in places where they should be safe. The Babadook, the quintessential Australian Gothic horror, spotlights the haunting of women's trauma and the challenges in escaping this trauma, particularly that of mothers through personal loss, feelings of isolation, and living with a constant violent threat. Both of her films have a dark Gothic atmosphere that haunt in both supernatural and psychological ways. Women have lived with these themes throughout history, and the growing depiction here speaks to a space that's been created for discussion, reflection, recognition, and attempts at healing from these experiences. Amelia's struggle with the grief of losing her husband while trying to meet the expectations of motherhood haunt her in many ways, as manifested in the titular monster, the Babadook. While the story plays out in several other settings, such as at the school, in the nursing home where Amelia works, much of the film and where the horror takes place is in the home. The home space appears to have both an emptiness as well as an overwhelming sense that something is close. Shot in a widescreen aspect ratio, Kent uses negative space to build this feeling of unease in the audience. This also highlights that there is something missing in this story. Sam's cousin Ruby even taunts him that Mum told Dad she didn't want to go to your house because it's too depressing. This articulates the home as a symbol of Amelia's depression. The home feels isolated from modern life. Though it is set in a contemporary time period, the furniture, architectural features, and decor have an old-fashioned look. This home is then imbued with this sense of isolation that has represented Australia and the Gothic. As Amelia struggles to move forward, her home remains stuck in the past, with her husband's belongings in the basement as she too attempts to repress this loss. The home is, of course, a symbol of domesticity, and with only herself and her son Sam there, her burden of motherhood can be symbolised in this haunting she feels in this space. And this is a truth that is very difficult to face. When the Babadook, as part of herself, is then kept in the basement by the end of the film, she'll feed it to keep it there. The home will now always contain this presence and this trauma, although she is now learning to live with it. The home is suburban, and although this may seem far from the castle ruins of a traditional Gothic setting, the setting is uncanny and is a symbol of a continental sense of belonging. As Australians, particularly recently, grapple with the enduring trauma of the past, all the complex histories are being acknowledged, discussed, and have become ever present in day-to-day life as we learn to reconcile. The Babadook, as a manifestation of her unprocessed pain, mirrors how unacknowledged historical trauma can linger and haunt a nation. And just as Amelia must face her grief, Australia continues to grapple with its colonial legacy and the impact on modern society. The horror of the Nightingale is the colonial brutality and its effects on women and the Indigenous people of Van Diemen's Land, which is present-day Tasmania. However, it is not solely the setting of the land which poses the threat. Yes, it is secluded, but it is very much in contrast with the vast desert plains of the centre of the mainland, though is certainly a Gothic representation. Physically, it is more wild, and horrors committed against the Aboriginal people on the Isle have only recently begun to be discussed, and this truth is still not fully acknowledged. It's not just in this colonial period, but there have been more recent atrocities committed against Aboriginal people there. Though again, recently, there has been apologies for the scientific research and museum practices that have resulted in immense hurt and suffering to Tasmanian Aboriginal people. The film's depiction of the environment is one that is only able to be navigated by Aboriginal Tasmanians, specifically the trackers Billy or Mungana and Charlie. There is a seeking to make claim to this place as home. The opening of the film establishes the idea of being out of place and at home at the same time. This is seen with Claire waking at home with her husband and baby, and then cradling Bridget as she sings a traditional Irish song while walking to work, on this land as a claim to her identity. Lieutenant Hawkins then has her dressed up to sing to a visiting captain and the soldiers, as he says, to sing a good old British love song for all us homesick lads. This is starkly contrasting her sentiment of home. Here, attempts to establish aspects of home on Van Diemen's Land highlight that this is the endeavour of settlement, one of Anglicisation. Furthermore, to me, I see the lighting and colour of this film as reminiscent of colonial era painting, aligning with an Australian Gothic tradition and references to this time period. Both the colonial soldiers and the convicts and white settlers are not home in this space, and they hold contemptuous and racist attitudes regarding Aboriginal people who are. Power dynamics are reasserted when it comes to the land. When Charlie deliberately misleads Lieutenant Hawkins' journey to Launceston, this is due to his superior understanding of his country. He then mocks that you own all the land, here is your land. However, the reminder of the cruelty of colonial soldiers is swift, and when Ruse suddenly murders Charlie for this, following Charlie's murder, the soldiers fear the land as a hellhole. This relates to prior original representation of this setting in Australian Gothic film. Ironically, most of the hell has been brought by them through their journey to Launceston. The kidnapping and rape of Palawa woman Loana, her distressing and devastating loss of her son, and the numerous bodies they've left hanging in their wake. Billy's cultural burial of Charlie contrasts the dehumanisation and cruelty that's surrounding them, emphasising resilience, humanity, and a cultural identity. Hawkins and the officers still make it to Launceston, where Hawkins achieves his aim of promotion. Therefore, while knowing they are out of place on the land, they are still able to assert power and dominance over it and the people who live there through violent and inhumane means. When the older white couple take Billy and Claire into their home as a safe place, it speaks to a comfort that older white Australians have in having found a place and comfort here. As the man invites Billy to eat at the table with them instead of the floor, there's also a subtle suggestion that the humanity of Aboriginal people is seen by only a minority of Australians, or as a reminder of the country's need to include everyone at the table. Australia is facing this truth currently, and its impact through acknowledgement of what was committed during this period. For example, through the apology from the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, and of course in more recent events in the 20th century, such as the Stolen Generation and the historic apology for this. This reflects the unease of many white Australians today that their own privileges are built upon the suffering of Indigenous Australians. The Nightingale addresses colonial and male violence through its treatment of women in parallel with the treatment of the Tasmanian Aboriginals. This extends to the treatment of Irish convicts through Claire's experience. After her performance, she is faced with leering, sexually aggressive treatment from other soldiers as she serves them. When she is alone with Lieutenant Hawkins, he rapes her, and the experience is not the first. It's also not to be the most devastating experience she has at his hands. Her husband, Aidan, confronts Hawkins, demanding he release her as his property, and punches him. Then the family tries to run. Hawkins and other officers walk into the family's home as they are preparing to. The tension of this scene is highlighted through a lack of non-diegetic music, but there is a diegetic haunting wind and cries from Bridget. These cries continue as Aidan is shot and Claire is raped by both Hawkins and Ruse. There is a sudden cut of silence from the crying when Jargo murders Bridget. It is impactful and incredibly traumatic to witness as an audience, and they then leave Claire for dead. The film's narrative is driven by Claire's seeking of revenge, though it is complexly wound with re-traumatization through each attempt she makes to do so. She's faced the most devastating, unimaginable horror within her own home, with her husband there. This setting of this scene as a place of her loss makes this place exposed, that she is not safe. These are the Gothic themes of isolation and death in relation to place and the domestic. There's also a recurrence of a haunting Irish music that she sang to Bridget as she's running from Hawkins, with hallucinations of Bridget and Aidan. Claire is closer to home the closer she is to death. The dream is a supernatural Gothic element. Despite their assertion of violent dominance over the land and its people, Aboriginal, convict, and other colonists, Hawkins and Ruse do meet their end. While Claire hesitated when she faced the opportunity to shoot him, she confronts Lieutenant Hawkins with words, which is in recognition of her own humanity. Billy's role in being the one to kill both Hawkins and Ruse with a traditional weapon was well painted, with emphasis to his Aboriginal identity. This is symbolic of strength, agency, and that Indigenous methods remain a powerful tool of resistance. His ceremonial paint is not just a preparation for battle, it's a reclamation of his spiritual identity and his agency, which had been stolen. By delivering justice in such a way, the narrative of Aboriginal Australia being denied voice and agency is subverted. Although Billy is shot, Claire takes him to follow the river, as he requested, closing the film with them standing apart, looking out at the same morning. The symbolism leaves viewers with the understanding that their experiences and backgrounds, while different, share a trauma that, despite trying to break it, results in more death and violence. The brutal nature of the experience of Aboriginal characters and Claire as a convict woman speak to a male brutality represented as colonial, though applicable to the contemporary time in which the film was produced, due to its addressing the intersectionality of present gender and race politics. While Larissa Behrendt rightly raises questions about the experiences of Billy and Claire as being comparable, it is urgent and a relevant message. To set and shoot the film in Tasmania depicts place in a specific way that resonates with Australia's growing acceptance of facing the history on the island, attempts at reconciliation, and no longer othering Aboriginal people, or not doing so collectively, but telling Indigenous stories in rich and meaningful ways through recognition of Billy's fight for his home and Claire's repeated loss of her sense of home. While the contemporary Australian Gothic landscape has continued to evolve since these films' releases, by contrasting both of these films, we get an important understanding of the complex depiction of place in Australian Gothic film. While the Babadook does contain more traditional horror conventions than the Nightingale, the depth of the psychological trauma that both women experience in their respective homes is connected to the tension of history of place, a threatening environment that reflects both guilt and trauma and a resemblant of Australia's approach to its history and its national identity. It is through Australian Gothic films that filmmakers can reimagine these established conventions through a reflection of the country today. The modification of the Gothic in Australia can be traced since settlement through literature and art, and continues to reflect social, cultural, and historical factors implicitly and explicitly. In viewing Australian Gothic from a contemporary context, we can recognise trends, and we may see things like a climate or eco-Gothic, as Australia is seen as a sunburnt country. You might see things like the cost of living and late-stage capitalism impacts on different groups. And with production being so significant in the development of Australian film, that the influence of the rise of original production through streamed video on demand platforms may see further influences on place in the industry. To conclude, I've just included this image that I generated in Adobe Firefly about the Australian home. I think it reflects an interesting representation of place in Australia. Perhaps this is an area for further research on this representation. It certainly has a Gothic feel and is situated in the bush or outback land. It's an idea that our home exists and surrounded by this permanently. Thank you very much. I do have included some acknowledgements and further reading and viewing sources if you are interested in knowing a little more about the Australian Gothic or the Australian film industry. There is a streaming service called Brolly, which is free, but it has some incredible Australian films that are hard to find elsewhere. So I'd recommend there. And I've also included again, not exhaustive, but a suggested film list if you're looking for a place to sort of find recommendations for these films. Thank you.